And we'll start the program.
I hope I'm not going to say the same thing as
Can you believe it?
Okay.
So we have a... You sure you had nothing to do with it?
Good afternoon. My name is Paulo Sotero. I am the director of the Brazil Institute here at the Wilson Center. I am here with my colleague Kent Hughes from the program on Science, Technology, American and the Global Economy. We are very happy to welcome you all here. I'm particularly happy to welcome the Director General of the International Labor Organization and also Secretary Mr. Tapiola and also Ms. Ponticelli from the Labor Department. You are in a sense home because this is the Daniel Patrick Moynihan boardroom. And I would like just to ask Kent to say a couple of words about the significance for us of having ILO Labor Department here at the Moynihan boardroom.
Of course, we celebrate Senator Moynihan here in part because he was a major figure in starting the Woodrow Wilson Center. That, as you may know, Woodrow Wilson was the only president to have earned a PhD. And when they were thinking of how to honor him, they decided, and Senator Moynihan had a lot to do with this, they decided that another marble statue or another monument wasn't quite the right thing. They wanted a living monument that captured both sides of Wilson's life. So our mission here is to really bring together the thinkers and the doers, as we say, the people that are making policy and the people that are thinking about that policy and its impact. And Senator Moynihan, in many ways, embodied that in his own life. He was perhaps the only senator who would take his summer break, go to his farm in New York, and write another book. People in the Senate used to say that he had written more books than most of them had read. And that's only a slight exaggeration. But the tie to the ILO is also fundamental, that Senator Moynihan wrote his PhD dissertation on the ILO and was always a strong advocate of the institution, served in the Labor Department, I was reminded, as Assistant Secretary of Labor at one point in his career, and continued to really be an advocate for and hold high expectations for the ILO. And I'm going to let Mr. Tapiola, Executive Director Tapiola, tell you a little story later about Senator Moynihan's a more recent visit. Well, again, we both want to welcome you all to the Wilson Center.
Mm-hmm. And it's very important, actually, to establish this partnership between the ILO and the Wilson Center. I am particularly interested as director of the Brazil program. And I would like now to pass the floor to Jessica, who will conduct our conference today. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kent and Paolo, for that warm introduction. And on behalf of the ILO's Washington office and our colleagues from Geneva, welcome all of you to this afternoon's events. I'm going to be kind of guiding us through to this afternoon, and want to start off with, we have two discrete panels. The first is going to be with Mr. Kerry Tapiola, and then followed by Ms. Charlotte Ponticelli. But just to set the stage briefly, this is going to be a discussion primarily about the findings of a report, Rights at Work, which all of you should have. The forum is really to discuss the impact in 4 countries, Brazil, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Morocco, although altogether since 2000 the ILO has had 70 countries involved in the declaration program. And the U.S. has been the single largest donor to the ILO's technical cooperation in this area, with $56 million out of $100 million total. So for that we are very, very grateful for the U.S. support, and we'll be hearing more about that in just a moment. Just in terms of some of the order of proceedings, we actually are having a webcast of this event right now, and so for those who aren't here, we're taking questions for the end at the webcast address of www.wilsoncenter.org/Brazil. So at the end, we'll be taking some questions. So without, in terms of the opening address and then keynote address, let me first introduce Mr. Kerry Tapiola. He is the Executive Director of Standards and the Declaration's Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work program. He has been with the ILO since 1996 in a variety of very seasoned roles he's had with both the governing body prior to that for 5 years, work in Finland since 1974, where he came to the ILO's International Labor Conference for the first time, and an extensive experience with the ILO. So he will be opening today's proceedings. Mr. Tapiola.
You want me to speak from there or
Wherever
from
you're
here?
most comfortable. Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Let's make the beginning a little bit formal. Just like to say how glad I am and thank on behalf of the ILO for the organization here. So, Madame Ponticelli and other colleagues who are present, and ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to first note here that what we will be doing today here is speaking about an experience that we have been having over the last 10 years or so, where the Department of Labor, together with other U.S. partners, including the employers and the trade unions, have played a key role. And I would, right at the outset, thank the Department of Labor for its support and for the active role in strengthening the observance of core labor standards worldwide. Because what we're talking about is core labor standards. When it was adopted in June 1998, so the Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work was the ILO's response to the trade and labor standards debate, which was particularly active at that time when the World Trade Organization was being put up and so on. And this declaration has a number of important and in many respects unique features. One of these unique features is that through the declaration, fundamental principles and rights at work, or also known as core labor standards, apply to all countries. All countries, whether they have ratified the relevant ILO conventions or not, the 8 human rights conventions of the ILO in the areas of freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining, abolition of forced labor, elimination of child labor, and elimination of discrimination. All countries have an obligation to both implement these standards and, in one way or another, to report to the ILO on their application. And this obligation goes beyond the legal obligations that arise out of ratifications. And this is because in the negotiations for the declaration itself, so it was noted that these 4 categories have their roots in the constitution of the ILO. And consequently, all ILO member states have pledged themselves to respect these principles. They had already been singled out in a major consensus document, the declaration of the 1995 World Summit for Social Development held in Copenhagen. And that also was with some rather strong involvement by negotiators who were involved on the ILO side in the process. At that time, it was recognized that the core labor standards are ILO standards and that they apply to all. And Copenhagen, already in 1995, said that ratifying countries have assumed all legal obligations under the ILO conventions on these 4 categories, and non-ratifying countries have the obligation to strive to live up to them. So everybody has to do something. Now, over these last 10 years, the following things have happened. The consensus that core labor standards are ILO standards has been strengthened. It has been adopted by the whole multilateral system, including the WTO and international financial institutions, as well as regional cooperation bodies. And so we do not have a situation where you would have different interpretations in different parts of the system on what the core labor standards actually are. There is clarity. The 4 principles and rights of the 1998 Declaration have also been incorporated in the UN Global Compact, and they are increasingly referred to in corporate codes of conduct as well as framework agreements signed between corporations and global union federations. So they have become a criteria for corporate action and a criteria for action by the trade unions at the national and international level. The conventions themselves have become highly ratified, although not yet universal, so we can speak about a roughly 90% ratification rate. And in some cases, as with the Convention on the Worst Forms of Child Labour, which actually was adopted only in 1999, after the declaration, the rate has been almost spectacular. To date, we have 165 ratifications out of the total 181 ILO member states. The United States was the third country to ratify this convention in December 1999. The follow-up of the declaration, which is what we are very much going to look at here, relies, of course, partly on the reports, but not on reports alone. It takes place through technical cooperation, assistance on the ground. Assistance on the ground, which means work with and support to the tripartite members of the ILO family, governments, the relevant government authorities, employers, and trade unions. And this also means that the profile of technical cooperation by the ILO has changed considerably. There scarcely was any technical cooperation in the area of core labour standards before the early 1990s, particularly before the child labour programme, the IPEC programme, started in 1992, which was something that actually eased in the approach of the declaration. Today, the child labour programme is the ILO's biggest single technical cooperation programme, with about 30 donors, one of the leading being the United States, and with activities in some 85 countries. And we see results. The number of child labourers globally fell by 11% between 2002 and 2006. The number of children in hazardous work decreased overall by 26% and by 33% in the 5 to 14 age group. Of course, I'm not saying with this that we, the ILO, or all of us who work together in the ILO, can claim all the credit for this, but it reflects a growing awareness and also an increased use of the kind of methods that ILO technical cooperation promotes. The follow-up of the 1998 declaration led into several new activities and also a program on, or rather against, forced labour. This is a program which is active now in over 30 countries. It deals with both traditional forms of forced labour, bondage and slavery, as well as with such things as trafficking of human beings. Trafficking is a sad reminder of the ugly reverse side that growing globalization has. The declaration follow-up has allowed for technical cooperation to strengthen core labour standards in many countries in transition to democracy. And I would like to just use one example. A case in point is Indonesia, which until 1998 was one of the biggest problems in the ILO's standard supervisory system. And after democratic change, which led into the ratification of all the core conventions and programs of implementation of these conventions, so technical cooperation, much of it supported by the United States, has aimed at the implementation of freedom of association rights and decent industrial relations. And this is just one example of the kind of changes that we have been witnessing over the last years. The approach that we follow under the 1998 declaration is an essential part of the overall ILO aim of achieving decent work. Now, this relies on combining, in the right way, the traditional ILO aims of creating jobs and strengthening social protection, and using for this the tools of international labour standards and tripartite cooperation. The 4 countries we will speak about today are examples where we were able to do something through donor support. The support has been generous, allowing us to carry out declaration-related core labour standards activities in over 70 countries. However, there are others who need and request assistance, which we have not, or at least not yet, been able to address due to lack of resources. So there is much work to be done, and much work for all of us to achieve rights at work everywhere. Now, there was a reference made in the beginning to Senator Moynihan, and I would like to just finish off by a little true story, which I had the privilege of being a little bit part of. At the time when the Declaration was adopted in 1998, when the Declaration started taking shape, when the basic idea of the Declaration reaching out to all countries, both ratifiers and non-ratifiers, and having teeth in order to address questions in all of these countries, started coming up. So Senator Moynihan was visiting Geneva, and I was invited to a lunch in the U.S. ambassador's residence, and I was asked to tell over this lunch to Senator Moynihan what the Declaration was all about and how we were going about it. This was the time when the Declaration was being shaped. So I explained. I explained how it combines ratifying and non-ratifying, the overview of ratifying countries, non-ratifying countries, and how it relies on work on the ground. And, Senator Moynihan listened, and then he started clapping. And then he said that, yes, this is what he had hoped all along that the ILO could do. So I thought it was important in this room to tell this story about Senator Moynihan's reaction to the Declaration at the time when the Declaration was being conceived. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carr, for setting the stage and for providing that comprehensive perspective on the Declaration, the 4 core areas, and now in light of decent work issues as well. Let me now welcome Charlie Ponticelli. Do you want to speak at the podium? Or?
Yes.
Okay, great.
I'll follow.
Okay, as she's... Okay, Charlotte Ponticelli is the Deputy Undersecretary for International Affairs at the U.S. Department of Labor's Bureau of International Labor Affairs. Prior to joining ILAB, Charlie was with 4 years at the State Department and in several senior roles as Senior Coordinator for International Women's Issues, actually where I met her for the first time, and then also Senior Advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Population, Refugees, and Migration. She has extensive experience throughout government and includes some service at the White House, the Office of Legislative Affairs, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. So let me turn the podium over to you.
Thank you, Jessica, so much. And on behalf of the U.S. Department of Labor and our International Labor Affairs Bureau, really want to thank all of you for giving me this opportunity to really commemorate the ILO's adoption almost 10 years ago of the Declaration of Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. To echo what Kari has so eloquently pointed out, the Declaration is a landmark expression of key rights and obligations of working people. Shortly after its passage, and consistent with the Declaration's stated objectives, the U.S. government initiated a range of endeavors to promote and implement the key goals of the Declaration. In his second inaugural address, President Bush really said it well when he stated, quote, "It is the policy of the United States to seek and support the growth of democratic movements and institutions in every nation and culture," end quote. And, as many of you are aware, in all of the free trade agreements signed by this president, there is a recognition of the importance of the Declaration principles. Over the last 7 years, the Department of Labor has supported the ILO's efforts to provide support and assistance to member states in their efforts to realize the fundamental principles and rights at work. DOL has funded and implemented a total of, I think it's $56 million for projects in 31 countries. This past May, right here in the Ronald Reagan building, President Bush reiterated the charge to all of us. He said, quote, "We're going to use our aid to help developing countries build democratic and accountable institutions and strengthen their civil societies." The President added, "To succeed in the global economy, nations need fair and transparent legal systems. They need free markets that unleash the creativity of their citizens. And they need a business climate that welcomes foreign investment and supports local entrepreneurs." End quote. By implementing the Declaration, we are really helping to build democracies by strengthening labor market institutions, reforming legal frameworks, and building up the capacity of labor ministries and other key institutions. I'd like to mention, if I could, just a few examples of the efforts the Department of Labor has supported through the ILO Declaration Program. In Bangladesh, our 4-year program in the garment industry trained almost 400 factory managers on labor relations and working conditions and reached more than 72,000 factory workers using methods as varied as formal classroom sessions, educational posters, videos, live street theater, and audio broadcasting during working hours. As a result of this training, more than 300 factories introduced workplace improvement plans. In Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Panama, the institution of the electronic case management systems has improved the efficiency of the inspectorate by providing data that has enabled inspectors to target inspections in a much more efficient and transparent way. In Nepal, we worked with ILO on the elimination of bonded labor, even in the midst of a very difficult and unstable political and security situation. The project focused on rehabilitating 14,000 families of ex-Kamayas, the bonded laborers. Vocational and skill development training was provided to more than 3,000 adults, creating greater employment opportunities and improving their living standards. Our efforts there in Nepal have helped more than 34,000 adults who have become members of 3 different trade unions, and we've also, of course, done a lot to promote collective bargaining and implementing minimum wage in agriculture, including campaigning against child labor in the project districts. In East Africa, our projects have helped with the reform of labor laws, bringing them into harmony with the Declaration principles. Tanzania and Uganda have already passed new laws, and Kenya is expected to follow suit this year. Judicial and settlement machinery has been upgraded in all these countries, and the number and quality of labor inspections have improved. All 3 countries have increased budgetary allocations to revitalize tripartite labor advisory boards. In the Middle East, DOL-sponsored programs on labor reform have made a significant contribution to our efforts to encourage democracy and promote free trade in the region. For example, in Jordan, one of our projects led to the development of new labor legislation that is about to be presented to Parliament. While not yet perfect, it is a much improved law and really a step in the right direction. Also, in Bahrain and Oman, DOL projects implemented by the ILO are formalizing tripartite cooperation and dialogue that is needed to mitigate and mediate labor issues. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our joint endeavors, really, to help save children from some of the worst forms of labor. In our El Salvador time-bound program, more than 36,000 children working or at risk of working in some of the worst forms of child labor are now using their hands to hold pencils and textbooks in schools and after-school centers. The project has not only changed their lives, it has helped transform the educational system and the attitudes towards education in the communities where they live. In collaborating with our ILO partners on all of these projects, we have asked our partners to report not just on activities, but also on the impact of the programs. As most of you know, this administration places a very high emphasis on performance and results. In fact, a guiding principle of the President's management agenda can be found in just 2 words: results-oriented. Not only do we want to know the outputs or the activities, but also the outcomes, what has really changed as a result of our activities. We would like to thank the ILO for organizing this gathering here in Washington to report on the impact of these programs. The reports give us a unique opportunity to hear what has been accomplished with the funds made available by the United States of America and the Department of Labor. While we all recognize that whole systems cannot be changed overnight, and that, of course, real change takes a lot of commitment, resources, and often time that we feel we just don't have. But it's worth noting that significant results can be accomplished with small but well-targeted and planned programs. These programs can help point countries in the right direction and set them on a course for change. It also shows that with good programs, good administration, and knowledgeable and experienced professionals, that institutional change is possible. I want to thank Kerry Tapiola. I want to thank Armand Pereira, Jessica Secor, my old friend, and all the staff of the ILO Washington office for inviting us to participate in this event. And, of course, we have to give special thanks to our friends Casper Edmonds and Wael Issa and Lisa Wong for all the work that they have done on today's events and all the work they have done with the Department of Labor over the years. Finally, I'd like to give heartfelt thanks to the members of my team, the International Labor Affairs Bureau, who are here today. It is a true honor and a pleasure to work with them and to learn from them and to see so much of what they are doing to support the work of the ILO in standing up for these core principles and rights. We at the Department of Labor are proud of the work that we've been able to do through our many partnerships with the ILO, and we thank all of you who are here today for supporting this partnership, which is standing up in defense of freedom, ending discrimination, providing help and hope for the most vulnerable, and to expand economic opportunity for all. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Charlie, and for sharing the country examples and talking about some of the transformative experiences that those countries have experienced as a result of our ILO-U.S. government partnership. Let me just, for the last member of the panel, let me invite Colin Fennick up to the podium. He's the author, one of the authors of the report, the Rights at Work report, and I will introduce him, and then following his remarks, we'll have about 5-10 minutes of clarification if you have any questions from the audience, and then we'll turn it over to the second panel. So, Colin, if you want to make your way up, I'll just give you a quick introduction. Colin has had 15 years of experience in the field of labor relations in Australia, the U.S., and in Switzerland. Among other things, he has worked with the ILO in the past as an official and also as an external consultant. But I should point out that the report that he did was an independent assessment of the work of these 4 countries that are under observation in this case. So with that, let me just turn it over to Colin to share some of the findings of the report.
All right. Thank you, Jessica. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for all coming. Some of you I've met before and I know a little bit, and perhaps some of you I will get to meet at the reception afterwards. Thank you also to Mr Tapiola and Ms Ponticelli for setting the scene in that way, particularly you, Deputy Undersecretary, for explaining that one of the key things that you're interested in is the impact of the projects, because it's important to explain at the outset, I think, what the purpose of the report is. You have a copy of the report in that plastic bag. I don't know what other exciting things you've got in there, but you've got a copy of this report. And its purpose is not to evaluate particular projects. Its purpose is to endeavour to give you some idea of the impact that some projects have had in some countries. In the 4 countries that we've looked at, There have in some cases been more than one project. The structure of the report offers you some detail in each case on one project that's been carried out, but also addresses the other fundamental principles and rights at work that are covered by the program on promoting the declaration, which, relevantly speaking, does not include child labour, although Deputy Undersecretary Ponticelli mentioned that. The program on promoting the declaration is not responsible for running child labour programs. So there's no attention in this report to child labour programs, whether in these countries or elsewhere. The other thing to say is that, as Jessica mentioned, I'm not the only person that contributed to this report. I've got a named co-author, Thomas Kring. He's the one who was smart enough not to spend a lot of time on an aeroplane getting here. I was the one who didn't have anything better to do for 20 hours, so that's why I'm here. And we also, of course, were supported by research teams both in Australia and in Geneva, and by Zafar Shahid, the head of the Declaration Unit, and Waelisa, who's been involved in overseeing a lot of these projects. So my thanks to them for their help in enabling us to put this together. Just some key points which I want to start with, and then what I'm going to do is pick out some highlights in respect of each of the countries and then follow with some concluding remarks about how I think all of these things come together. Some of these things cross over a little with what Mr Tapiola and Ms Ponticelli had to say, so I won't dwell on this too much. But what we think the report shows, first of all, is that the principles embodied in the Declaration are capable of applying and assisting in a wide variety of countries that are looking at transforming themselves both socially and economically. Brazil, Indonesia, Vietnam, Morocco are all in different stages of economic and social development, all in different forms of transition from one political system to another in different ways, all of them working towards some type of democracy. But for all of these different countries, the Declaration has been useful as a guide for social policy, and in some cases has been an effective catalyst for developing the political will that is necessary to go forward with the transformation that's required to labour relations systems. Secondly, it's important to acknowledge that whilst particular projects that have been carried out under the auspices of the Declaration and to implement the Declaration have specific objects and therefore are narrowly focused in one sense, a project on freedom of association and industrial relations or collective bargaining is not unrelated to the principles that are elsewhere in the Declaration. Freedom of association doesn't only support collective bargaining, it supports the ability of workers to organise themselves and to free themselves from forced labour, or to address questions of discrimination in the labour market, and to the extent possible within the parameters of project guidelines, the projects that we looked at have certainly endeavoured to focus on that interlinking. The third thing to point out is that the projects have tended to start with legal institutions, but they've also placed a very significant emphasis on making legal institutions and the bodies that are necessary to make them run properly, to make those things effective in practice. So that means there's an emphasis on capacity building for the unions, for the employer organisations that use dispute resolution institutions. There's an emphasis on capacity building for the ministries and government agencies that oversee the operation of laws, for the judicial officers that have to make decisions in new dispute resolution systems. All of these things are important focuses of the way these projects work. Fourthly, as Mr Tapiola mentioned, there is this emphasis on working with the partners. And this is very important because, as I'll say at the end, it tends to suggest that projects to implement the Declaration and the Declaration itself are compatible with and help to promote both democracy and good governance. By working with employers and workers and government to get them to facilitate a process by which they will decide what their new law will be, that helps to embed processes of social dialogue and engagement between the state and civil society, which will have ongoing effects. And it goes, in a sense, to, without saying the last point there, that all of these things show that there is an emphasis in these projects on sustainability of outcomes. It's not about dropping into a country and delivering some training or dropping in a new label, or everything is done with the social partners in a way that will enable them to move forward after the project is concluded. So, first, Brazil. Here the project on which we focused was the project on combating forced labour, which ran for about 3 years or so, I think is concluding right around the end of this year, with a budgetary allocation of $1.7 million During that period, over 17,000 workers were freed from conditions of forced labour. Very significant impact of the project. If you divide that into the $1.7 million of the project budget, it's a little over $101 per worker freed. Everything else in the project you got for nothing. So there were a lot of other things that went on there. A very significant emphasis on training for judges. There were some complications in the Brazilian judicial system, some conflicts between federal and state jurisdictions as to which was the better place to deal with the laws concerning the practices of forced labour in the country. Some of those things have been resolved, obviously not necessarily through ILO work, but there's been a heavy emphasis on training the judiciary, some of whom were inclined to be imposing relatively lenient penalties for some of these offences. Over 1,000 judges were trained at one stage. More than 8,000 CD-ROMs of important information on the laws were distributed to judges, to prosecutors, to attorneys and so on. In total, the project trained over 11,000 people during its life. In addition, you see the second point, coordinating government and civil society. The project, in a number of respects, has worked closely not only with government and employers and workers, but with other civil society actors, NGOs. It's worked closely with CONATRE, which is the government agency responsible for overseeing the activity to address the problem of forced labour. Established by the Lula administration, it is not only government, employers and workers, it has NGOs involved. The ILO has been involved on a 2-monthly basis in facilitating its activities. So again, you see this link to democracy and good governance. So there's been a significant amount of effort also on awareness raising. All of these projects have put a lot of effort into general awareness raising beyond the partners in the midst of the project, if you like. 300,000 booklets on the law were distributed. An assessment of the project identified that there had been over $7 million worth of media coverage of the issues generated during its life. So again, you see very clear, measurable outcomes and significant impact. So that's just that project in Brazil. Unfortunately, notwithstanding the scale of the report and the scale of the project, so I've got a relatively limited time here to get through them. There have been other ILO activities to address some of the other issues that arise in terms of the fundamental principles in Brazil. Discrimination in the labour market in Brazil is a significant problem, particularly affecting women and also people of Afro-Brazilian background. The Lula administration has established 2 cabinet-level agencies, one to deal with racial discrimination and another to deal with gender discrimination, and the ILO has been involved in assisting each of those to carry out their functions, and in particular on the gender equity side has been involved with the relevant government agency in implementing at the municipal and state level a program on gender pro-equity, which has enabled it to get more than 60 companies involved. Here it's in a sense promoting an approach that it's also used in the forced labour area, where it's helped to develop a corporate social responsibility initiative which has seen again over 60 corporations agree not to do business with those who profit from forced labour. Finally, in the area of freedom of association and collective bargaining, in Brazil our report shows, as some of you would know who are familiar with the country, there are some peculiarities to the legal system in terms of the right to form and join trade unions. There are some limits on the right to bargain collectively. These have not been the subject of a specific ILO project, but ILO work has been carried out to try and take the issues forward, and with some ILO assistance there is some progress evident in terms of proposed legislation. Institutions have been created and recommendations have been made to the administration and to Congress, and so there is a prospect that perhaps these things will change going forward. The final point appears on each of the next 3 slides as well as this one. It's a common theme. It's, in a sense, why the work needs to be done, but as Mr Tapiola and Deputy Undersecretary Ponticelli both pointed out, why a lot more work needs to be done in the future. These are developing economies in every sense. There are high levels of poverty in all of them. On one estimate, there's over 50% of labour market participants in Brazil in the informal economy. So there remain significant challenges, but on our view, there have been significant achievements to date. Thank you. So Indonesia, this is a country that Mr Tapiola mentioned in his introduction, and as he said, had been one of the countries that had been the subject of the most stringent scrutiny by the ILO's system for supervising compliance with conventions. Shortly after the fall of the Suharto regime, Indonesia recommitted itself to the ILO and to the principles of the declaration, and it suddenly became the first country in Asia to ratify all 8 of the ILO core conventions. But you don't, of course, make freedom of association and the right to bargaining effective. You don't make a freely functioning labour market effective simply by ratifying ILO conventions or agreeing to pursue the principles of the declaration. So a key focus of the ILO's work here has been revising the domestic labour laws, the national labour law system, and it's what I'm describing today, if you like, as a full service arrangement with the ILO. The ILO has been involved from the beginning to the very end of the process. The ILO facilitated the tripartite process, which agreed on the policy that would become the legislation. It then provided assistance in drafting the legislation. It provided expert commentary on the drafts when the drafts came through. It then provided information, education and awareness raising to legislators to ensure that when the legislation arrived in the Assembly it would pass without too much difficulty. Following on from there, the project paid its attention to raising the capacity of the ministry to administer the legislation, of the workers and the employers to work within the new framework. So that meant that with ILO assistance, Indonesia got a new Manpower Act, which is its Basic Working Conditions Act. It got a Trade Unions Act, which of course was important in a country which had had a single trade union system under the Suharto regime. And it got a new labour dispute settlement law. As part of that new labour dispute settlement law, there has been created a labour court, a special separate labour court. The labour dispute resolution system that operated in Indonesia up until then was regarded as being fairly corrupt and unreliable. So we now have, as an adjunct jurisdiction of the civil courts throughout Indonesia, a labour court jurisdiction which is to be exercised by civil court judges accompanied by ad hoc judges, one in each case from the employer and the worker side. They have received intensive training from the ILO project in how to act impartially as judicial officers, in how to make their decisions, in how to draw on relevant legal decisions both from within Indonesia and from cognate jurisdictions in the region. So that's been a very important focus, as has training for employers and workers in collective bargaining skills, in mediation, in negotiation and so on. All of it directed to ensuring that disputes where they arise can be resolved at the level of the enterprise and not break out into costly industrial action. And in that respect, there's been a focus in this project on effective labour relations at the level of the enterprise. The project operated in 7 of Indonesia's 33 or so provinces. It carried out a pilot program on bipartite labour management cooperation. The Indonesian labour laws require enterprises of a certain size to establish bipartite labour cooperation forums. So in order to stimulate good example, if you like, to promote the observance of this obligation and to get people to see the benefits of this, a pilot program was run, the outcomes of which included more collective labour agreements freely negotiated, collective labour agreements that had better outcomes agreed by both employers and workers, and easier negotiations to get those collective agreements. So very positive effects from this. Now, outside of that particular program, which was also notable for the fact that it promoted the labour legislation in terms of awareness raising, one of the key things that it did was to actually publish copies of the legislation in both English and in Bahasa Indonesia. It worked with the ministry to build their capacity to understand how to do that and the desirability of doing it, and then published many, many copies of the legislation, which was well received throughout the country. There was, before I move on to other areas to discrimination and forced labour, I should note also that there was and is a problem in Indonesia about respect for the right to associate and the right to bargain collectively. It's still not uncommon for strike action to be met with a hostile and even violent response. So there was another project that the ILO ran on this occasion with support from the Department of State to train the police around the labour law and around the rights of workers to strike from time to time, so as we don't get this problem of strikers being arrested and being thrown in jail when they're lawfully allowed to go on strike. In terms of gender discrimination, the ILO has helped Indonesia to develop equal employment opportunity guidelines, and in the area of forced labour and trafficking, Indonesia has a significant problem In trafficking, because it's both a source and transit country for trafficking into other parts of the region, but it's also a source country for labour migrants, many of whom go to the Middle East, and the migration agents, the labour migration agents, are not very well regulated. They've been charging very significant fees for people to get into this work, and when they end up in the receiving country, they find themselves in conditions akin to forced labour. They're bonded in debt. So the ILO has been working with Indonesia to develop better regulation of these migration agencies. In Morocco, again we see an emphasis on revising law and making law effective in practice. So again we see that the ILO helped facilitate a tripartite process for revisions to the labour code there in 2004, which had the effect of better recognising independent union and employer organisations, which also provided for a more expansive role, if you like, for the Labour Inspectorate. So in order to make that new law effective, in order to assist Morocco in its efforts to become a more market economy and to participate in free trade, it has an FTA with the United States, of course, a lot of focus was put on the ministry here and raising the ministry's capacity to carry out its objectives. Under the auspices of the project, over 80% of Morocco's labour inspectors received training on the new legislation. Not all of it directly from the project, because in that focus on sustainability, the project trained a network of trainers within the Labour Ministry who then delivered training out around the country to their fellow inspectors. Likewise, the project endeavoured, with differing degrees of success, to build networks of trainers in the trade union movement and the employer movement. But going back to the ministry for a moment, two other key things were achieved at least. One of them was that with the assistance of the project, for the first time ever, the Morocco Labour Inspectorate has a bilingual French-Arabic labour inspection manual. Never in its life before have the inspectors had this, now they do. Is that a signal, Zafar?
No. Taking your picture.
The other thing that's happened is that the ministry's been assisted to develop an enforcement strategy around the legislation, and inspectors have been assisted to develop their own inspection methods. And the ministry's been assisted to develop a rolled-out implementation program for the labour code so that they can work across the country and make the labour code effective in practice. It would not surprise you to learn that gender discrimination in the labour market is a problem in Morocco. To some extent that has been addressed by revisions to the family code, the civil law that regulates the status of persons in Morocco. So this has lifted some of the legal disabilities that affected women in Morocco. They are now better able to enter into contracts, which means of course they are better able to be either employers or employees in the labour market. There is a ministry and it has a research arm in Morocco. The ILO has helped the ministry to develop a program to map gender discrimination in the country as a basis from which to develop good policy going forward, and has also helped the ministry to establish a specific program to improve working conditions in the textile, clothing and footwear industry, which is, as in so many other countries, an industry that's heavily dominated by women employees. In terms of forced labour and trafficking, Morocco has, obviously, because of its position in proximity to the European Union, a lot of challenges to address here. It's very much a shipping or transit country for people from all over Africa and other parts of the world seeking to get into the European Union, in addition, of course, to its own citizens wanting to get out and go to those places. So it's amended some of its laws to address those problems. It's also got some other problems in respect of legislation that permits people to be subjected to penalties, including forced labour, and the ILO has been working with Morocco on that. So our fourth and final country, before I wind my way towards my conclusion, Vietnam. So again, a project looking at establishing effective labour market relations. Now, of course, in Vietnam you're looking at, in common with the other countries, a country that's in some sort of state of change in terms of its political and economic situation, but of course here you're looking at the transition from planned economy to some degree of market economy. How much remains yet to be seen. So here the program focused very much on assisting government, employer and workers to understand and be able to carry out their role in a free market economy rather than in a socialist system where we're all supposedly having the one interest. We all have different interests in a tripartite system. So again, there was an emphasis on workplace labour relations. As in Indonesia, in Vietnam, the project ran a pilot program across a number of provinces to work with enterprises that are obliged under the law to establish bipartite cooperation forums. Again, the outcomes were positive. There were more labour agreements negotiated. The content of the labour agreements was better. There were more trade union members and there were more trade union representatives who were trained to represent their members in a way that perhaps they hadn't formally because of the otherwise official relationship between all trade unions and the Vietnam General Confederation of Labour. Now, of course, that's, if you like, the elephant in the room for Vietnam labour law going forward is the problems with the labour code. Those are things that will have to be addressed going into the future. The program very effectively established tripartite task forces in each of the 7 provinces where it worked, and with their assistance was able to help the government to establish for the first time advisory services on labour relations, which are now permanent parts of the government structure in each of those provinces. They have continuing appropriation for those services and they will be there to provide assistance to those who are operating in a private sector labour market way. In addition, again, there was an emphasis on awareness raising, and over 23,000 copies of a booklet on the labour code in 4 different languages were distributed across the provinces where the project was working. On gender discrimination, of which there is a considerable amount, as well as some ethnic and racial discrimination in Vietnam in the labour market, the ILO helped with the government's establishment of a research centre for female labour and gender, and also helped it to carry out a major study of gender discrimination in employment, so that going forward again it can establish good policy. As with some of the other countries looked at, there are forced labour and trafficking problems in Vietnam. There has been a freeing up of capacity for people to move around the country, at least since the year 2000. This has facilitated trafficking. Women particularly are trafficked through Vietnam and on into China for domestic service, for prostitution and so on. Vietnam's been working on those issues with a consortium, if you like, of international agencies. There have been some other forced labour problems in relation to ILO Convention 29 issues. There are some laws compelling people to provide service to the community for a certain period of time each year. But with ILO assistance, those laws have been amended, and just in March last year, Vietnam was able to ratify ILO Convention 29. So, I want to move away from each of these 4 countries just a moment and try and say something about what we can say about the relationship of the Declaration and the principles that it contains and other developments in society, because that's in a sense what we try and do in the report. The report is in each case about more than just the one project, it's about the broader situation in each country, because we have to view these things in a much longer context. The first graph shows you just the GDP in US billion dollars of each of these countries, which again emphasises that there are significant differences between these countries in terms of the size and the nature of their economy, but all of them are finding it useful to look to the Declaration as a guide for their social principles. So no matter the size of your economy or perhaps the state of your development, the Declaration apparently can be useful to you. The second graph is GDP figures, annual growth figures. Now, on the left is Brazil's annual figure for 2006. The other 3 figures for Indonesia and then for Morocco and Vietnam are annualised figures. And so it's necessary to take those with a certain amount of caution. If you take Morocco, for example, the 3rd column from the left, that is an averaged figure over the last 4 or 5 years. Now, last year Morocco's growth was 7.6%, but Morocco is a heavily agricultural economy still, and so if there is poor rain, then output is going to be low. But an average of 4% over a year over the last few years is suggesting that Morocco is on the right track. What we think that this shows is that revising your legal frameworks to implement the fundamental principles and rights at work that are protected by the Declaration is at least not inconsistent with continuing positive economic development. This shows the sectors in which people are employed in each of these countries. As you can see, in 3 of the 4 there's a predominance of employment in the agricultural sector and relatively little in industry in any of them, which of course suggests that there is a significant amount of work remaining to be done. The graph on the left here compares the Human Development Index for each of these countries as it was in 1998, that's the pale blue bar, with the Human Development Index for each of them in 2004. So you can see in each case that there's been an appreciable growth in the Human Development Index for each of these countries over this period. So again, adopting legal frameworks and committing yourself to the principles, fundamental principles and rights at work is at least not inconsistent with continuing broader socio-economic development. The last bar there is the Human Development Index for 2004 for Norway. I put that there by way of comparison to give you some idea of what any of those figures might mean. Given how long it would take any of these countries to get to as high an index as that, it suggests, I think, that the level of growth in index over those 5 or 6 years signifies that things are going reasonably well. On the other hand, the right-hand graph shows the percentage of the population living in poverty on the most recently available figures. So as you can see, Brazil had both the largest figure for annual GDP but also the largest figure for people living in poverty, which suggests, as those of you who know Brazil, significant inequality across society. So last, what do we find? As I've emphasised at the outset and along the way, there's a heavy emphasis on legal frameworks in these projects, but not just on saying to countries you must revise your labour laws, on helping countries to devise the policy that will create the labour market institutions that can underpin solid and sustainable economic growth with sound industrial relations, and with that heavy emphasis on institutional capacity building, which is important to make sure that those laws are effective going forward. Secondly, as I emphasised, the principles of the Declaration are interlinked with each other. The ILO takes a holistic approach to this and endeavours in its projects to achieve positive outcomes in as many areas as possible, notwithstanding the specific parameters of projects. And thirdly, and this is the important one I think, implementing the Declaration is consistent with democracy and good governance, not least because of the sustainability element, the capacity building element, and the emphasis on working through the tripartite social partners and emphasising social dialogue. But it appears also to be consistent with economic and social progress, which is of course the objective here, and it gives the lie to the idea that sound social and economic regulation is going to be a brake on your capacity to participate in the global economy. So the conclusion is, as the final point says, that the US Department of Labour funding has contributed very significantly to these countries taking steps to realise the fundamental principles and rights at work, although there remains much to be done. Positive effects have been achieved in Indonesia and Vietnam, but only in 7 provinces in each of those countries, for example. So relatively small budgets have achieved relatively good outcomes, but there is plenty more work to do. Thanks for your attention.
Great. Great. Thanks so much, Colin, for really drilling down into some of the practical achievements and also some of the challenges in each of those 4 countries and the diverse issues that were faced there. Before we take some questions, let me also introduce you to Mr. Zafar Shahid, who's all the way on the end here. He's the director of the program on promoting the Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, and he's been in charge of this program since 1999. He's been with the ILO since 1979, working also on pay policy and labor relations issues since then. His prior experience was with the UN Commissioner for Refugees. And in addition to the countries we just listened to, Zafar could also answer questions that you may have. Some of his work interacting with countries related to the Declaration in China, the Gulf states, Uganda, Pakistan, and the former Soviet Union, among others. There's a whole laundry list of countries that he's very familiar with. So with that introduction and his willingness to take some questions now, does anybody have any questions for clarification or need immediate response to?
They're all persuaded.
Yeah, that's right.
We
Your
win.
presentation was so brilliant. There's no questions.
Any questions? No? Okay, and please, we have some roaming mics. If you would say your name and your affiliation, that would help us in answering. Okay, here's...
Winsome Packer with the Helsinki Commission.
Okay.
Can you talk a bit about the challenges that you encountered in attempting to implement some of these initiatives? For example, the legal reforms or the capacity building in the ministries. Did you encounter resistance culturally or otherwise?
Maybe we'll ask Zafar to give
Zafar, yeah.
his glance.
Did you mean in general or in a particular country?
In general. I mean,
In general,
from
yeah.
country to country.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
how did you address the?
Yeah.
How do you get to
Yeah, I think it's a very important
board.
question. And I think that if we go back, since we're talking in particular about U.S.-funded projects, U.S. dole projects, there was an interesting area of collaboration between us, which was that when the money came in, we had to program that money very rapidly because there's always limited windows of opportunity once your process starts up. And there was pressure, naturally, to get things done. But we were very concerned that the projects that we wanted to do were actually coming as a demand and as a felt request of the countries in question. So the ILO's procedure is really such that you work with the Ministry of Labor in the first instance, and the Ministry of Labor works with its social partners, the trade unions and the employers. And it's essential that those people should see eye to eye in terms of the work that's requested. So I think it's a question of us, making the possibility there, but the political will having to be there on the side of your social partners, I think. An example that I can give you relates to Indonesia. When we started, there was considerable political pressure, I think, on Indonesia to move, both internally and externally. Once you start, however, then you can have little hitches that come along the way. For instance, there was one particular law that was supposed to go through rapidly, and it didn't, and we had started the project. Then it was a question of saying, all right, what do you do now? So you do awareness raising, you do advocacy, you do training of labor inspectors while you take other routes to make sure that you're moving that law along. That's one example.
Can I give an answer to this? Sure. Maybe if I could give an answer which is more of a general one, but it shows the kind of change that we have been looking at. And it started already with the child labor program. When we started with activities against child labor in the early 90s, so in many places there was a feeling that, look, if our government goes into these programs, that means that we then publicly, internationally accept that we have this program and that we are exposing ourselves. And there was a fear of that countries who are participating in a program with the ILO are in a way admitting that they have shortcomings and that they might be then the targets of different kind of activities, whether they're boycotts or calls for sanction or whatever. As we went along with these programs, with the different countries, so I think that also in these countries the view started changing. It started changing into saying that, well, actually, it's good that we have these programs because it shows that we're doing something about it. And it was an argument, actually, for the countries themselves to say that, look, don't blame us. We've got a problem, we've got shortcomings, but we are open to that and, help us rather than slap sanctions or whatever. Where, again, the technical cooperation side and the specific element that we have in the ILO of following up things also through the report system comes in, because then a country who is ready to get into this cannot actually just do it in order to escape in order to pretend that they're doing something, because we have a whole system of reports following that up. So if somebody gets into this system just basically by trying to say that, well, we're doing something about it, and etc. But if there is no substance to that, so the fact that we are working on a tripartite basis, and the fact that we are working in a system where you have continuous reporting also, so means then that if you do this simply for opportunistic political reasons, you'll get caught. But this is one of the important, say, psychological changes that we saw around the whole approach, and which gradually also led into that countries which maybe in the early 90s would not have wanted to have programs addressing questions like forced labor or child labor or so on. So in fact they have been very keen on having these programs and wanting to have more of them.
Okay. I think we'll close this panel off now, and we're going to swap the seats a bit, and we will bring on the next panel too, which is comprised of representatives. Well, first of all, let me thank the panelists for all of their comments.
Oh, that's right.
You don't change your
Right. That's right.
Okay, the panel that's approaching now represents the tripartite constituents of the ILO, the employers, the workers, and the government representatives. And so to speak to some of the lessons learned in not only the 4 countries under study, but to share some other reflections, we will have representative from the employers speaking first, then the workers, and then Roz Harvey, who's multitasking in this panel today. Okay, does everybody have their name tags? Okay, great. So let me welcome the panelists here, and I'll just give a quick introduction before each of them will speak. First of all, welcome to Helen Yang. Helga Yang, beg your pardon, Helga Yang. She's the Director of Worldwide Government Affairs and Public Policy at Levi Strauss & Company. She is also working on some different principal advisor and strategic issues for Levi Strauss & Company on government affairs and public policy. Before joining the Levi Strauss Company, she was a program manager and then director of member services at Business for Social Responsibility. So she's well aware of the kinds of issues that companies face when they're trying to work in the areas that the declaration involves. So just with that brief introduction, let me turn it over to you, Helga.
Okay, great. Thanks. And I want to thank ILO and Roz Harvey and the staff for inviting me. I'm going to be here to kind of give you the brand perspective and some of the work that we've been doing with the ILO. But before I do that, I just want to give you a little sense of the company. We are one of the world's leading branded apparel companies. Our brands are the Levi's, Levi Strauss, Signature, and Dockers. We're more than 150 years old. We actually market in more than 100 countries, and we source in about 55 countries. And from those 55 countries, we actually are using about 900 direct suppliers and licensees. And the impact to the workers on these 900 suppliers is about 500,000 workers. So we're truly a global, iconic brand recognized around the world. We do have a long history of addressing worker rights and labor issues. As I think most of you know, we were the first company, the first multinational company to implement and develop a code of conduct. And others follow suit, and we realize this is not the only approach and is not necessarily the only systemic way of approaching this issue. So we want to go beyond monitoring, and I'll go a little bit further about that. But in our code of conduct, I just wanted to make note, it's actually based on international labor standards and the principles included in the ILO Declaration on Principles and Rights at Work, which we are discussing today. Okay. Now, 15 years ago, this we felt was the right thing. This day and age, we feel that there's a lot of other issues, and that in order to be more systemic and sustainable, we need to address things beyond monitoring. And so we kind of have an approach where we do this through what we call our responsible sourcing program, where we have a three-prong approach to dealing with this. We do it at the factory level, so addressing auditing, working with our suppliers to start supplier ownership programs so that they feel and start learning more systemic ways of addressing this issue. More in terms of brand collaboration, where we're actually now working with about 15 brands who are in the same factories as we are to start sharing our trainings and our monitoring processes so that we're not duplicating those issues. And, as you know, we've recently published all of our list of factories in our website, so you're aware of where we are, and that we're hoping that stems from more collaboration. We also do work through the community level, where we actually support grants that help affect and address some of the worker issues around the communities where we're at. And then lastly, we do this through the public policy level, and that's where organizations such as the International Labor Organization comes into play. Because we know that we can't do this alone. We need a more sustainable approach to improving labor standards. And while we work with our suppliers to strengthen respect for worker rights in their operations, improving working conditions, the root causes of some of these issues we are seeing in factories stem from governance, from regulatory and infrastructure issues beyond the factory gates. And to see real improvement, they require industry-led or national level commitment and action. So these commitments and actions for us, we feel, include improving the labor regulatory environment, improving labor enforcement, encouraging governments to devote sufficient resources to labor administrations, addressing corruption, improving infrastructure. And we cannot tackle these more endemic issues alone, so partnering with the organizations such as the International Labor Organization is a very key issue that we need to address to go beyond monitoring to improve labor conditions. So why work with the ILO? The ILO has international credibility as the United Nations body responsible for setting labor standards and working with countries to implement and enforce these standards. But what we see, and I think a lot of other multinationals see, that is we can't just work at the individual supplier level to improve conditions, and the ILO works with it at the national level with employers, workers, and the governments to build the broader systems and institutions to provide the rule of law and governance for social change and economic growth. Thus, we feel the ILO can work at the national level on issues that is difficult for us as companies to deal with alone. And through their tripartite structure, the ILO can serve as a neutral, credible convener to bring multinational companies such as Levi Strauss & Co. into the conversation with employers, with workers, with trade unions, with governments at a national level. Now I'm just going to briefly go over some of the initiatives that we've been working with in terms of the works that the ILO has developed. And one is, as all of you know, is the Better Factory Cambodia initiative. We've been participating in that program since July of 2005. We currently source from from 14 supplier factories in Cambodia, all of which are participating in the Better Factory Cambodia monitoring and remediation initiative. And what we found in terms of this program and some of the benefits are, one, reduced monitoring. This engagement with the ILO has allowed us to step back on our own monitoring of these facilities and rely on the ILO monitoring. It has allowed us to focus our efforts less on policing and more on remediation and training for sustainable change. So that's been really important to us. It's also open dialogue with some of the local stakeholders. The Better Factory Cambodia opens gives us a chance to work with and have a dialogue with the local trade unions, with industry associations, with the government officials on a whole range of issues in a way we could not do this unilaterally. And next week we're actually attending one of the ILO organized international meetings in Cambodia to kind of discuss how to move this program forward as it progresses, and also to see ways that we can replicate its strength in other sourcing countries around the world. The other thing is increased brand collaboration. We alone are working with some of these companies to address these issues, as I had mentioned before, but within this Better Factory Cambodia program, there are 15 other multinational corporations that are working working with us and seeking to increase collaboration to reduce the monitoring burden on factories and build on each other's trade and mediation effort is really actually very important. And lastly, I think it really demonstrates a commitment to worker rights, which increases trade and economic growth. I think in the years since the launch of the Cambodia, Better Factory Cambodia, you've actually seen growth in the apparel industry. And so I think that sets an example of, once we hopefully, or ILO replicates this in other countries, that you might see growth there as well. And we look forward to working with the ILO on other initiatives, potentially in Vietnam and Lesotho too. We are currently in Vietnam, where the ILO has the Factory Improvement Program. We've been doing that since August 2006, and I know there's talks about a Better Works program there in Vietnam. And our suppliers have been engaged there, and we feel that it's been really important because it's allowed us to participate in some of the ILO trainings on workplace cooperation and social dialogue, productivity, quality, safety and health, and human resource management. And the quality and the credibility of the ILO training supports our own remediation and training initiatives in the factories and efforts to build kind of more of a supplier ownership of labor management systems. And we also hope to work with you as you expand the Factory Improvement Program on disability and HIV in the workplace. HIV and AIDS has always been a big issue for Levi Strauss & Co. We've been in involvement in the fight against HIV/AIDS for some time, and we were proud back in 2001 to be one of the U.S. employer representative of the tripartite discussions at the ILO that actually led to the adoption of the ILO Code of Practice on HIV/AIDS in the world of work. So essentially, we know that we can't do this alone, and I think it's important as we, Levi Strauss & Co., engage in more multi-stakeholder initiatives that we're finding that if we work collaboratively with organizations like the ILO, with trade unions, with the governments, with NGOs, that we can find more systemic ways of addressing worker rights. And so just thought I'd give you this quick overview. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have later on.
Okay, great. Thank you, Helga, and for sharing both Levi's pioneering approach to some of the work and also for ongoing efforts in collaboration and partnership beyond the factory gates, as you rightly mentioned. Let me turn it now to my colleague immediately to my right, who is representing the Brazilian Union, Brazilian Workers' Perspective on this panel. Her name is Marissa Silva. She's a sociologist, and she's been a researcher with an institute that actually focuses primarily on the types of issues that the Declaration covers, and she's been there for 7 years. The institute, the Social Observatory Institute, I can't say it in Portuguese, but it was originally born out of one of the projects of the CUT, which is a large Brazilian union in the country, and it has several other partners as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Marcia now. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank you, the ILO, to invite me to this panel, and I'm very happy to be here and talk on behalf of the workers from Brazil. And before I start, I need to apologize to you and sorry because my English is not the best. I just started learning English, so let's do it. I used to work in the Observatório Social, this institute, and they use the standards of ILO to the conventions to do the research. And we used to go to the big companies, multinational companies, and we asked them about all these activities, or all this convention, what they doing about this. And we realized that the workers, also the companies, the directors, the management, they don't know how to do. They can agree. I assign about the conventions, but I don't know how to implement this. And the Observatório Social, they are launched exactly in the same time that the declaration of the principle of the ILO, and we open arms to working together, because it's one way to make the information come from like the academy or the high studying about the labors on Geneva or United States to come together with the working, with the employers, with the union, how they use this in the day-by-day working, day-by-day struggling for the rights and improve the conditions. So I'm here to talk about this program and how the employers, how the union get this information and use them in the activities. Mrs. Colin Farron talked about the Brazil and they explain the facts and the results about this. But when I work in there and I go to the union and talk with the laborers, and for me it's very important for us, for our organization, when they start to understand how to use this information. And this make it their institution, their labor, their union more strong to fight and to negotiate with the companies, because they have the same table, the same reference to talking about some problem that it's for everybody. It's not only for the government to solve, it's not only for the employers to solve, it's not only for the workers to solve these problems. And I think that the Brazilians' political will now, it's very, very good. It's a very fertile, can see, to this kind of action, this kind of improvement of understanding and activities to getting better the working situation and the working conditions. And this make easy for us establish a new partnership. And the International Labour Organization is very important for us because they give us an international standard to negotiate with the government and the companies. And in the government now is it's open space to start new policies. And is that like Ms. Collins tell us, the creation of two secretaries, two ministries, to help in the discrimination for against women and against Afro-Brazilians. This is a big step in Brazil to discussion, to start to change stuff. A few years ago, you cannot talk about the race issues. So we have a discrimination against Afro-Brazilian. No, it's not a problem for us. This is not an American problem. You are imported in a problem. This is not true. You can see the data. You can see two Brazilians. One Brazilian is very have a very high opportunities and conditions and salaries and income, and another one living in the poverty, very, very low incomes and condition of life. So we have two Brazilians because the inequalities, but you can talk about. Now we started this discussion, and even we don't make nothing in this ministry, only because we create one ministry to talk about this, this is a big step. You can look forward and imagine that you can walking on this path and make changes. And we have a good support, a good international support in Geneva, in Washington, and many places to help us to be a guide to these activities. Another ministry for promoting women equality, gender equality, it's for me very pleasant to, when I sit with the director of companies, and they are proud to say, we are on to get the stamps from this secretary. The stamp is a benefit that the company get in the end of the 1 year when this company start promoting equality, and in the end, when they pass one evaluation to see everything that we implement gets some better for the women inside of company, so you get a stamp. And many companies in Brazil are run to get this. This is very important for me, and I get very happy when I saw the director in the company tell me they are proud to be part of this process. And a few years ago, they don't talk about this. We don't need to do this. We have a lot of men working very well, so we don't need a woman here. So it's very complicated to read this and now to see how these behaviors change. Another very terrible situation is the compulsory and forced labor. Brazil is a huge country. It's almost the same size that the United States. And we have a concentration of urbanity structure in the southwest. In other parts of your country, we have a huge Amazon forest. We don't want to be huge forever. I don't want to miss the Amazon, but you get some problems over there. You get small cities and big companies working this place, exploring the subsoil, exploring the woods, and whatever you do so on TV is true. And you don't have a strong civil society to push them, to control them. And you have also the corruption in some parts of the government. So it's very difficult to reach this place and to make these rights and these conditions getting better. So this program in Brazil, it's innovative and very important for us because gave us opportunity to go there. You don't go there like one organization. It's like it's a group of organizations. It's a civil society, and it's the press. So you get the information and you start to do something. And these people that also didn't know about the rights from the employers, the rights from the workers, and they don't know how to get to this in the law, to get to this in the good way. So some of them learn, some of them not. Still doing the slave. You can do this. You can tell this. Some of these farmers or companies, they learn with this process. It is very good for us. Another one, we still need to work with them to stop in this kind of exploration. But this problem, it's not specific for Amazon or remote areas. We can see the same problem in São Paulo. It's a largest city, maybe the second or third city in the world, and you found there a lot of slave works. The people that come from Colombia and Bolivia and Chile, they come to looking for working, and they are invited to work in the textile companies, but they take all the papers, passport and whatever ID, and put them in the basement of the buildings, and you never see them again. So you start to find out about this problem in the big city, in the large city in São Paulo, and you can see it's the Chinese group also. So it's a huge work to do to stop this kind of slavery and forced work. And we just start in the urban areas. We just think we thought this is a problem for the Amazon or rural area, but it's not. It's inside of urban area also. So it's a huge problem. And you have almost 20 million people rescued from these workings. But we have a social problem for inequality. So when you promote when you fight against the discrimination and you fight for the reduction of poverty, you maybe reach the end of the slavery. Because if you are slavery now, you are working for a worse condition, you have a bad situation in your life. But the government go there and rescue you. And you don't have nothing to do. You don't have no jobs, no access to this, no another opportunity. So you come back. This is happening also. So you need to amplify this struggle, not only focus on the rescue the people, but rescue them to offer a different opportunity and promote the equality and promote the really economic insertion with rights and good conditions for work. Another point is I have opportunity to observe Brazil change too fast. I was a teenager when you have the first election for president, and I went to the school and I sing the national music, I don't know, the national theme, for obligation, because the military say every day you need to sing this, and everybody had to do this. But now makes sense some this, but in that time it's like, this is bullshit. What is it? And all kids learn to do this every day. And when finish the military system, nobody sing anymore. Only in the soccer play, only in the soccer game. It's true. So when I saw the civil society from Brazil growing up, improving her activities and making partnership, and every day, I think it's a example of the world. I'm very proud and I'm very happy to be part of this, to work with the labor union in Brazil. And I have to say, I think maybe 70% of the civil society in Brazil is starting the labor union. It's a very important. It's not from the religion, it's not from the church, it's not from the sport organization, it's from the labor union. And they became one organization, another one, and they specialize and specialize on this one. And this makes our civil society very, how to say, effervescent, very hot, whatever. And I think it's the social forum, the World Social Forum, it's the best example of this moment that you have there. And I think it's international organizations, ILO, UN, UNICEF, many others, it's very important for us as a guide and reference, because when you bring when you bring the discussion inside, you say, it's not a problem only for you, it's not a problem only in the United States, it's an international problem, it's for us. This is, for me, it's very important. And I'm surprised. I have met last year many people from different worlds, and believe it or not, some question that you discussion and you say this is for everybody, like human rights, some people don't understand like this. So we have a lot to do. A lot to do. I'm surprised with this. I think we need to born again several times. Thank you for this opportunity.
Great. Thanks, Marcel. Okay, thanks to Marcia for sharing the both the realities and complexity of what's going on in Brazil across rural and urban areas, but especially efforts to promote equality and some of the examples of forced labor currently in place. Now, the final panelist for today is Roz Harvey. Now, she's the global program manager for the Better Work program, which was it's a collaboration between the International Finance Corporation and the ILO. But what she's going to be talking about is actually her work with the Better Factories Cambodia project, which has now taken root in this Better Work collaboration. So let me turn it over to Roz. She's got a PowerPoint presentation.
Thanks, Jessica.
Thanks, Roz.
Thanks, and thank you to the other panellists here today, and to the panellists that started the session. I think that we've had a very good kind of overview of the importance of the declaration. What I want to talk about is really just another case study, if you like. I think we heard this morning that in the first session that there's been projects across 70 different countries funded by US dollars, part of these declaration projects. The one that I'm going to talk about is actually one of those, just one of that huge family of work that has been done together between the US and between the ILO. So the first thing that I just want to say about the Global Better Work program is that it is really a new program. It's a program that's a joint partnership program with the International Finance Corporation. The International Finance Corporation is the private sector development arm of the World Bank. And together, as part of this Global Better Work program, we are looking at how to improve labour standards and competitiveness in global supply chains. Now, the focus of that work from the labour standards piece is the declaration. It's the declaration and national labour law. And I think this is very important in terms of how this program goes forward and contributes to the broader goal of building sustainable industrial relations systems at the national level. Now, the program is really happening because of the very groundbreaking work that was done in Cambodia. IFC and ILO collaborated in the implementation in Cambodia and are still doing so. And the experience there has actually led to this global program, which we're now looking to reach out to a number of other countries. As part of the Global Better Work program, we there's two parts. Part is developing a set of global tools which would be available to the global community, and the other in the first stage is development of 3 pilot projects which will directly affect 800,000 workers. So that, taken together with the Cambodian project, this family of projects will in fact be working with over 1 million workers. We're currently with IFC considering how this program can be rolled out to a broader range of countries and a broader range of industries. The point of telling you this is how incredibly a project that started like in Cambodia can actually lead to have much greater impact than where it started. I think that the US should be very proud of the work that's been done in Cambodia. A lot of it came from many of the people in this room who've been involved in its setting up and establishment and in the work that has been done. Ooh, we're playing musical slides. Next one. So, in terms of the background, essentially there was a US and Cambodian trade agreement, and effectively what that agreement did is gave incentives to improve labour standards. And the incentives at the time came in the form of increased quota access to the US market. And both the parties, the employers and the governments of the two countries, approached the ILO to ask for assistance in actually working out what was happening with labour standards, but also for technical assistance, which is what we've been talking about today. How could we actually work in Cambodia to improve capacity to have better labour standards in a sustainable way? One of the things I really want to emphasise here is that Better Factories Cambodia is only part of a broader ILO engagement, and indeed ILO in partnership with US engagement in that country. There are actually many other projects in that country that are contributing to the development of the industrial relations system there. In particular, there's an arbitration council project that has set up dispute resolutions that's been incredibly effective and recognised as providing an independent and credible way of dealing with disputes. There's the child labour program. We have a trafficking program. We have a range of technical assistance to the government. And I think one of the things that we've really learnt out of this is that you can't look at enterprises as though they are in a bubble. You can work with companies like Levers, and I think this is the point that Helga was making in her intervention earlier. You can work at the enterprise level, and indeed that's very important work. We should in fact work at every level that we can to drive implementation of good labour standards, but it's not enough. And I think this is one of the things that we really have learnt. You know, an employer can strive to really have a genuine sort of freedom of association within their factory gates. But if trade unionists are being shot and there's an environment of impunity external to that factory, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think what we've learnt as part of the work with Better Factories Cambodia is it's incredibly important to leverage powers of globalisation to make changes in implementation at the factory floor, but it has to be part of a broader strategy. And if we don't make those connections, then we're really not going to be as effective as I think workers in developing countries deserve. In terms of the approach in Cambodia, and I think this is a very important part of it, I think one of the reasons it's attracted a lot of attention is that it's tried to come up with very practical solutions to issues of labour standards at the enterprise level. But one point I do want to make is that the monitoring gets a lot of attention. And yes, it's very important, but it's actually only the first step of the process in Cambodia. First of all, the ILO does independent assessments of compliance with core labour standards and national law, but then it works on with the employers, with representatives of workers and with government to actually make improvements in the factories. So it makes suggestions and it does capacity building. At this point in time, less than 30% of resources in Cambodia is actually focused in monitoring. Much more of the resource is actually focused in fixing problems, and that's the way it should be. It is important to know how enterprises perform against labour standards, but it's only the first question. Perhaps the most significant question is what you do to fix it. And effectively, what the program is doing is trying to harness the pressures of globalisation to drive change at the enterprise level. When the project started, it was clearly linked to a trade agreement. There's no doubt about that. But that expired with the MFA. Now what we have is a program that is in fact driven by a market driver, which is what do economies have to do to be able to bring product to market? And increasingly, to bring product to market, factories are having to meet standards on labour standards, such as we heard discussed by Helga from Levi's. And I think that it's an amazing achievement in Cambodia that in the absence of the trade agreement, that the tripartite partners, government, employers and unions, have agreed to continue the program on a voluntary basis. And indeed, every single factory that exports is participating in this cycle. And I think that says a lot about the program itself. In terms of impact, and I agree we should talk about impact, very important. What we've seen is a very high level of compliance in the industry. We're seeing less than 1% child labour, and most of that is to do with young people falsifying their records because they're desperate to work. This happens in poor countries, similar to what Mercia was talking about with slavery in Brazil. I think very interestingly, we've seen a unionisation rate in the Cambodian industry of 45%. It's gone from 21 percentage points 3 years ago to 45 percentage points now. Now, if you are looking towards sustainable industrial relations systems, obviously this issue of organisation of workers and the ability to exercise freedom of association and to bargain is very important. We've seen a reputation for labour compliance, not without its warts. There's still problems. It's not a workers' paradise in Cambodia, and there's many issues I'm sure that Kerry Tapiola could tell you about that we've had to deal with from a labour standards point of view. But we have seen a growing reputation for labour compliance. And I think someone else made the point earlier. It's not a question of saying everything's perfect. It's a question of being able to say that the tripartite partners are working together with international buyers to make sustainable and genuine improvement. We've seen 70,000 new jobs since the 1st of January 2005, and you'll remember that there was a very great concern that the whole industry would be wiped out with the end of the MFA. That hasn't happened. But most importantly, we have seen that the volumes of increase in sales in Cambodia have come from the buyers who have been working with the ILO in this program. So in fact, the volumes there with those buyers have actually increased at twice the rate of the industry average. So if we just go on to the next slide, it's very quick. I just wanted to show you the employment graph. And I think that this is very important. The mission of the ILO is to create more and better jobs. And I think I've talked about how we tried to make them better jobs, but we're certainly seeing a very substantial increase in an environment that's pretty tough out there in terms of competing in the new deregulated market. So finally, I just want to talk about better work. I know we've got very limited time. Jessica's being lenient with me. Essentially, what we, as part of the new Global Better Work program, we're taking lessons that we learnt from Cambodia and many of the tools, but not only in Cambodia. The ILO, as you know, has had many programs and many interventions around the world. Many of those have excellent tools and approaches. What we're trying to do is put that together in a new global partnership with IFC to reach out the impact and extent that we can engage. Now, this particular slide is an attempt to give you an idea of how the operational part of this works. If you think of better work as a roof of the house, essentially what you want is two walls to hold up that roof. One wall is labour administration and inspection, and the other is the capacity of employers and unions to bargain, to have social dialogue. So you have enforcement and you have capacity building at social dialogue. And these are, in fact, very important outer walls that you want to hold up the house. The problem is, in many developing countries, those walls are weak. And they're not going to be fixed overnight. They're things that we as an organisation are extremely committed to working towards, as you've heard description of the projects that we are in fact engaged in. What Better Work is one intervention which says, can we look at industry-based schemes that use the pressures of globalisation to put in extra struts to help hold up that roof? And those extra struts are, yes, doing enterprise assessments against core labour standards and national labour law. Secondly, doing training and capacity building as part of this remediation process that emphasises social dialogue. And the third is looking at sustainability and engagement. And because we're working in global supply chains, it's very important to us to interface buyers with our tripartite constituents at the national level. In many ways, what we're doing in this program is in fact turning the imperatives and the way CSR has been done on its head. Traditionally, the way that it has been done is that multinationals have adopted codes of conduct, they've sliced up industries and in effect pushed the code down their supply chain and dangled factories off the end. What we try to do in this program is to in effect take the tripartite partners, build with their involvement and agreement an industry-based scheme that then interfaces with international buyers. And this is very important because it puts the tripartite partners and social dialogue and building national industrial relations at the heart of the agenda. And this is very important if we're going to have sustainable improvement and if we're going to have real labour standards and if we're going to push out beyond the direct target group of those working in the formal economy. Now, just finally, in terms of how this public-private partnership in some ways works, I just want to relay to you the conversation with the Vietnamese Ministry of Labour when we had this discussion. And we said to them, you know, how would you feel about this, having a tripartite scheme in Vietnam, which you're part of, that, yes, is looking at assessments in your factories, but is also focusing on improvement. What they said to us is, with our current capacity in labour inspection, we can visit factories once every 50 years. We have private sector auditors crawling all over our factories. We have no say in the way they're interpreting our law. We have no engagement in the issues with them. If you can create a tripartite system that we're part of and continue to support us in our development of the public sector and continue to support the outer wall of employer and union capacity building, we're all for it. And in fact, this is one of the meetings that Helga was referring to that's happening in the next couple of weeks, where we will be meeting with the tripartite constituents and buyers to discuss this program approach. So it's not a question of either or. It's very important when we work on assessments, we're working on national labour law. And so that's very important that we have strength in the ministries to set law and to administer it. It's very important that we have capacity amongst the employers and workers' organisations to actually participate in genuine social dialogue at national, industry and enterprise level. And just, I think it's hardly surprising the 3 pilot projects that we're working in at the moment, which is Lesotho, Vietnam and Cambodia as part of Better Work, all of those have a US Dole Declaration project at the moment. Because I think what's happened is through that work, it has created a way of bringing the tripartite partners together. It's created labour law reform. It's created a sense of what's required. And then we're able to come in and contribute to that as part of an overall programmatic approach. So that's Better Work and Better Factories Cambodia in 10 minutes, I hope. In your kits there's actually a little summary explanation of both. And I'd be very happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Roz. Okay, well that ends the kind of the formal presentations. Now, for those of you who have any questions for either panel, actually both panels are still present, so we can take questions here. Again, we have a revolving microphone. I see one in the very back. It was next, Casper, behind you as well. First one here and then in the back, yep. And again, state your name, although I know this gentleman.
My name is Jim Shea. I'm with the Department of Labor iLab. Question for you, Ross, and talking about the countries where you have the project going now, Jordan was conspicuously absent. Does that mean that...
Was it?
Yeah, you didn't mention Jordan. You said Vietnam, Cambodia, and Lesotho. I was just curious, is the Jordan project still going forward?
Do you want me to answer that now? Sure. Well, I have to put that down to my own nervousness, Jim. It's actually Lesotho, Jordan, Vietnam, and Cambodia is the existing project. And in fact, in relation to Jordan, we are in very advanced stages of discussion with USAID and the ministry and key buyers. And we're very confident that that program will go ahead, subject to finalising grant agreements. But I think actually I'm glad you raised Jordan, because Jordan is one of the countries where we really had a fabulous cooperation between different parts of the ILO. There's a declaration project in Jordan that's been working on labour law reform. There's a trafficking program there. There's one working on labour inspection. And through what we call decent work country programs, we're able to sit down with all the different interventions and plan how we work together to reinforce each other's effort. And in fact, one of the critical issues was in fact labour law reform, because currently Jordan doesn't give the right to migrant workers to unionise. And the government was very keen on the program. We all know why. And essentially, you know, what we were able to say to the government is, look, this is terrific. We would like to look at engagement, but we have to see progress in terms, if we're going to extend ILO's engagement in Jordan, you know, we'd like to see progress on our existing commitments. And a key part of that is the right of migrant workers to join unions, because in the absence of that, it becomes pretty hard to do this sort of project that we're talking about with Better Work. So it's been a place where we've actually been able to work together in a very programmatic way, which I think has, you know, really been terrific. Lots of work with Whale on that.
Excellent. Okay, all the way in the back, please. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tudor with the Department of State. As Roz mentioned in her presentation, that we have to be engaged in a number of different levels, and while this Better Work program is at the factory level, I'm very curious to know, this question is particularly for Helga, how private companies can ensure that their products are, particularly the cotton, is not harvested or produced without the worst forms of child labor or other violation of other labor standards at the farm level. I'm wondering if you, Levi Strauss, or your partners have been engaged on that issue at all.
We're actually, we've been engaged in terms of our direct factories and our licensees, but we have in our plan that we're going to start looking downstream and really going towards not only our licensees, but our sundries and all the way down to the cotton. I mean, it's very hard in terms of addressing cotton, because cotton's a commodity issue, and it's from all over the world so sometimes we don't know where it's coming from. But it is in our plan to start looking downstream and really kind of addressing the lessons we've learned from our direct suppliers and our licensees, which we start, and also our agents, to go even further downward.
My name is Jeff Wheeler, and I'll be traveling to Cambodia with a team from USAID in a couple of weeks, mainly for the reason that we've heard so many good things about the experience in Cambodia, and we want to explore it as a possible example. One concern I've heard expressed is that there hasn't been a sufficient focus on improving labor administration in the country, and the concern has been that by putting the focus on ILO, the role of the ILO in monitoring violations, it has minimized the role of the government. And so I'm wondering what efforts have been made to help ensure that the government capacity is increased.
I think this is a very genuine and real issue, and it's part of why you have to look at different countries and where they are at different points in time. There is direct assistance into the Ministry of Labour as part of the work in Cambodia. The challenges of working with the Ministry of Labour, I can tell you, are enormous in Cambodia. They have recently improved somewhat. We had a period for about 4 years where we had a Minister of Labour who was from a different political faction to the ruling party, and the whole place just was very difficult to function in, full stop. that has eased a little bit. We have a very big program with the ministry in terms of dispute resolution and focusing on mediation of disputes in Cambodia, which has also got a focus on improving working with the Ministry of Labour. So I think there are genuine issues in what you're raising. I think there's some very real structural issues in Cambodia, trying to be polite in how you actually operationalise that. And just to call a spade, and this is not just about Cambodia, you know, we have to deal with issues of civil service reform, of corruption. It's not just a question of increasing skill levels. You have to look at the realities of what are the drivers in a particular country. And Cambodia, we have a particular issue there with, particularly with corruption. And, you know, it's not surprising. Labour inspectors in Cambodia are paid $25 a month. They're actually inspecting factories where workers are paid on average $75 a month. No labour inspector could survive on the salary that they're paid. So, you know, you can pour in skills training into that environment, but if you don't look at the drivers of what's driving the institutional operationalisation, then you're pouring money down the sink. And, you know, I honestly think that we need to be more frank about that, and we need to talk with, for example, big players like the World Bank, who is, you know, often a very big player in public sector reform, about the relationship between civil service reform and effective delivery of public services. But it doesn't help to ignore the political reality in which, you know, and the operational reality in which we're in. And I think that's part of the issue in Cambodia, a big part.
Okay, well, that's perfect timing, actually. We'll have some closing remarks from the Brazil Institute.
Well, thank you very much. I think wherever he is, Senator Moynihan is happy right now. I'm particularly pleased for having had this event here. What we did here is precisely what the Wilson Center does, is informed debate of public policy. And it's a thrill to have the ILO here, the Labor Department of the United States government. It's a particular honor for me. The Brazil Institute was created about a year ago. Exactly a year ago today, I became the director. And the idea was to highlight Brazil in Washington with all our challenges and with all our virtues. And we have been working at that. I'm very happy that we're able to do Brazil also with other countries here in this wonderful event, very informative. I am particularly happy also for two reasons. You know, about a little bit over a quarter century ago, a guy by the name Stanley Gassick brought to this town a man by the name Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, was then a union leader. And we met. I already knew Lula. I actually managed to be his driver in part of that trip in Washington. And, you know, well, I'm very honored that Stan is here today. He's with the AFL-CIO. He's a good friend. And he has become even more Brazilian because he married a Brazilian after all that. I'm particularly happy for Mercia's presence here. I think she gives you, you know, the idea of what the struggle is and what the progress is that we have made in Brazil. And actually, yes, tomorrow, Stan and I will have the opportunity to testify in the U.S. Congress on Brazil-U.S. relations, and be sure that what we